Bailey, leader of the James Moore manufacturing team. I'm here with Kevin Golden, one of my partners and also a member of the James Moore manufacturing team. Today, we are joined once again by Ed Marsh. Ed is a business management consultant who has founded and operated several businesses. Today, as principal of Concilium Global Business Advisors, he assists lower middle market industrial manufacturers with strategy and revenue growth. This is a topic we're continuing to dig in on. We've had Ed on before, and we've hit this before, but sales, revenue strategy, growth. There's a lot of things that get unpacked into this sales and growth process, and it's an important driver in the value of a business going now and going forward. And I think as Kevin and I continue to talk to manufacturers, both clients and non-clients, we see this in the area that they really struggle on. So throughout 2024, Ed's gonna come back here and there to help really continue to dig in on this topic and to give as much information as we can during these short time frames to help manufacturers think differently about sales and sales processes. So Ed, welcome back in the show. Great to have you on.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I love these conversations with people who understand manufacturing, who are in facilities and understand the mindset, and it makes for a great conversation. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, and Ed, as always, thanks for being here. Anytime we talk with you, there's always seems to be a lot of great advice, a lot of information to unpack. So today, where do you think we should begin when we're talking about sales process and methodology and so forth? Where should we start?
Well, we'll talk about sales. We'll talk about process methodology. We won't use the dirty word marketing. Maybe another time we'll talk about that. I know that's not a word people love in the manufacturing world, but sales, I think, is undervalued. And so if we kind of back up and think about it, I mean, I know the core of your gentleman's approach to this podcast and your business is helping companies create value. Mm-hmm. And I'll quickly outdrive my accounting headlights, but basically, as I understand it, the basics of value is that it's an aggregation of the assets of a business and some discounted future value of income. And so if we really, the assets are relatively easy to measure. So it's that discounted value of the future income. What's the key to that? And I would maintain the key is to have a process that allows you to generate income effectively and repeatably. If you have a big windfall one year, that's nice, but it's not a foundation for value. You have to be able to replicate that on an ongoing basis. And that replication, in my experience, is where there's often a problem that manufacturers run into. They may have, last year they may have had 3.5% growth. They're feeling okay about that, except they haven't stopped to think about 7% of that being actually price increases. So they probably had negative growth. And if you look at real growth, it's not consistent. In my experience, companies have lots of processes for compliance and manufacturing and operations. They've got defined steps, and if they follow them correctly, they know that they'll get consistent outcomes. And you guys have it in accounting. You've got GAAP and internal controls and all kinds of matrices for making decisions about expense versus capitalized investments. But in sales, we often don't see that. As crazy as it is, if you back up and look at it, we don't see it that way. And that's true of the sales process too. Most companies say that they have a sales process, but I would argue that it's really more like a series of administrative steps. It's something that sounds like, okay, we got to find a project. Maybe somebody calls us, or an existing customer or a contact from one company moves to another. But let's say we find a project. Then we're going to collect the specs, going to get the technical details. Then we're going to create a quote, and then we'll kind of follow up, and then we'll wait. And we hope that the waiting results in something. What's really funny is you see people often associate some likelihood of a close progressively with each of those steps. Issuing a quote is often associated with an 80% likelihood of close, except that's so arbitrary. Think about how silly it would be if creating a quote itself was an effective step. Then we'd all do that as a first step if it made us 80% likely to close. It doesn't. It's fiction. So in manufacturing, you don't just list assembly steps. You have to check the lighting, and you experiment with fixtures, and you use machine vision to check. All of these things are around this process that you build, and we can bring that same mindset to sales. If my premise is correct, and an admin process doesn't really drive predictable revenue, then that explains why so many deals, and I think many of your listeners probably see this, many deals these days end in no decision. They're just kind of evaporate. The pipeline looks so full, and then so many deals. Oh well, next month, next quarter. Oh, they're still interested. It's going to happen, except it never happens. It just evaporates. It evaporates, and so if we want to fix that, then we have to really back up. We have to get the process right, and in order to do that, I'd say we have to be very careful about the terminology that we use, and so let's really kind of carefully define two different terms: sales process and sales methodology. And I don't know how often you hear both of those, but they're often conflated rather, but they're really quite distinct, and each one has its own meaning, and it's really important. So, a sales process is a series of steps that we can follow to take a project from the creation through the point of closed won. And an effective sales process is going to really focus on qualifying an opportunity and establishing how and when and why a prospect will buy. The what is relatively easy. The quote, is relatively easy. We all get the what, but the why and the when and the how and the who. Sales methodology, in contrast to the process, is actually the technique that you use to consistently execute the sales process. And you might find this might be most typically reflected in the types of questions that salespeople ask. Maybe the technique for asking them, the order they ask them in, the people they believe they have to get in touch with to ask them, and the technique for how they elicit accurate answers. So if we were going to dive into sales methodologies, which I don't think we're going to here today, but some of the names that might be familiar to people listening would be spin selling or Miller-Hyman strategic selling or Sandler sales or baseline selling. Those are methodologies. And companies need both. They need the process and they need the methodology, and sales managers need to coach and train on both of those, and salespeople need to be proficient. The sales process needs to be built into the CRM sales pipeline, not just kind of the typical admin steps, but qualitative and quantitative information to make sure that deals are being properly qualified so that they're reasonably forecastable, and then revenue becomes predictive. And I guess the final thing about the process as a entry point to the conversation, we had a conversation a couple of months ago where we talked about the need to have second or third standard deviation sales talent. It's hard to find those people, but it's critical because if you've got a really good complex sales process, average salespeople aren't going to execute it well. So you have to have those top performers. So there's my quick ramble on sales process versus methodology.
No, that's great. And I think, part of the problem when I think of process is, as well as they're repeatable things that you can almost drop somebody into a process that's well defined. Now, the methodology is, like you said, that's something that's trained differently, but a process itself is something that is well defined. It's executable, and you can measure your success or how you're doing on that, or your effectiveness. And so, to me, that's where, if you've just got somebody who's kind of been always doing it in your company, and they're out there, they do their thing, they're great, but they're also about to retire in a year, now you've got a big process. So as a company is thinking about, okay, Ed, I need I've got a process. How do I think about it in terms of its effectiveness? Because I got these administrative steps, like you said, I send a quote here, I do this, I do that, but what is, as they implement this, what are they thinking about in terms of effectiveness, and how are they measuring that and looking at that? Are there milestones? What is that approach?
Yeah, I think those are both really important questions. They're a little bit different, and maybe we can circle back to the effectiveness, because having good KPIs and measurement is really important. But to the second part of your question, the milestones, it's critical that you actually understand what those milestones are. And sometimes these sales processes end up so convoluted, it's either this simplistic set of admin steps, or it's so complex that people can't visualize what they're supposed to do.
Right.
For that reason, one of the things that I like is Dave Curlin's baseline selling. And he actually sells it as the only integration of sales process and methodology, and we could debate that. But the nice thing about it is it gives a very easy to visualize set of baseball analogies to help map the consultative sales process. And so you just think about running the bases, basically. So getting on first requires identifying something that the prospect agrees probably should be improved about their business. You've got in agreement, there's some kind of a problem. You don't know if it's a big one or a small one, or they're compelled to solve it, or it's just an irritation. You have no idea, but that's the start. It's kind of the permission to have a substantive conversation. And that substantive conversation begins as you move from first to second. And the first thing you really have to do is help the prospect diagnose their problem. And often prospects misdiagnose. I'm sure you have people call you up and tell you they've got, an inventory turns problem, and it actually turns out to be something very, very, very different.
Absolutely.
But you have to have the conversation. You have to dig into their books, and you have to talk to them about their operation. It's the same kind of an idea. Nobody goes to the doctor and says, okay, I want this operation done. You go and say, okay, I've got this pain. And then they ask you questions and they do some diagnostics, and maybe they say, well, you should have this operation, or go home and stop whining, or somewhere in between there. But we tend to describe our symptoms. And that's the way a doctor helps us solve it. And so a good salesperson has to be able to respectfully, you don't want to tell the prospect, hey, time out, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm the expert. Stand back and let me identify it. But through conversation, you have to be able to determine what the symptoms are, and then apply your expertise to understand the real problems, and then begin to help the buyer quantify the real impact on them and their organization. And that can be in terms of financial impact, or the ability to create new business, or add additional customers, or retain customers, or have a reliable supply chain, or whatever the case may be. There's often deeper issues that you have to be able to help people think about. And what's really interesting is great salespeople do that consultatively, just, as the word implies, like a consultant would. And by the questions they ask and by the conversation they have, they really differentiate themselves from their competitive salespeople. So some people, I live a lot in the machine world. Some people come in and they'll start talking about, oh, it runs this fast and this many per hour, this many meters per minute, or whatever the case may be, as opposed to, let's really understand your business and what are we trying to solve for. So that's a big step in the sales process, and it has to be measured qualitatively and quantitatively. But the point is, if we think about baseline selling, we can't move from first to second base until we really have established a compelling reason why somebody's going to buy, the cost for them doing nothing, make sure there's a qualified opportunity, and make sure that we agree that it's worth them working on. At that point, we probably have a qualified opportunity to put in our pipeline. You think about most of what goes in the sales pipelines. Somebody says, oh, I got a problem, send me a quote. Bam, it's in the pipeline before we even know if there's any likelihood it's going to sell. So that's a big mind shift change.
Well, Ed, really quick, I like what you said there before we move on. I like what you said there. The first few analogies. One, I'm a baseball fan, so always like any good baseball analogy. Because who would see anybody running from first to third or second to home? But also what you said about being a doctor. A lot of times, I think if we thought about it that way, right? I mean, it absolutely makes sense. And I like what you said, though, that your expertise, or what differentiates you, will come out in the questions you ask.
Right.
Because I can say, even whether it's in accounting, manufacturing, or any others, what do people like to talk about a lot of times? Oh, well, hey, you got that problem. Here's how we do that really well. Right. Like you said, that's probably more likely a symptom. It may end up being part of the problem. It may end up being the entire problem, or many times it's just one aspect of a problem, right? But then we automatically are quick to say, well, here's how we can help, right? Here's what we can do. Here's what's going to make that better. When, again, you may not even, that may be just addressing one symptom or so forth, but you're so quick to do that, as opposed to being more curious, I guess you could call it, and asking more of those questions, not only to uncover what that truth may be, what that real problem may be, but also that's your time to shine, where, hey, I know this industry. I know what I'm talking about. I know how to help solve the problem because I'm asking the right questions, right? So I really like that you mentioned that, because a lot of times in trying to talk about ourselves, we're trying to qualify ourselves, say, hey, look how good we are, instead of reminding ourselves that, hey, the questions we ask are going to help dictate that, not just how much technical knowledge about an area that we do have, or that our company has about our industry. So I really like that analogy, and that kind of rings with me and makes a lot of sense.
And I think a funny way to think about it is, if you take that approach, if as soon as you hear a problem, your happy ears perk up, you say, we can do that. We've done it for this company. Here's how we'd fix it. If we go back to that baseball analogy, what you're basically doing is running from first and you're cutting straight across the pitcher's mound to third base where you're getting ready to give a quote, give a proposal, give a presentation. And then you wonder why somebody says, okay, sounds good. Give us some time to think about it, as opposed to perfect. This is what we need. Let's get started. You can't cut. You can't skip second base. You got to round second. You got to identify the problem. Then you have to go through other steps and figure out who the decision makers are, and confirm they're willing to that they believe you can fix the problem for them. Confirm that they're willing to spend more money to do business with you. What their timeline is for the decision. All that kind of stuff. And along the way, another byproduct of that, kind of like those questions between first and second establish your credibility. The questions and the process between second and third address another major problem that's increasingly common in business, and that's kind of a resistance or a hesitance. As buyers tend to now make decisions as committees, and there's less a single person that says, this is the way we're doing it, I'm making the decision. There's often a lot more hesitance. There's an interesting book that talks about it, The Jolt Effect by Matt Dixon and Ted McKenna, really illustrates there's a transition point in most sales that go from the FOMO, the fear of missing out, oh, I've got to do this because it's going to cost me this much money if I don't do it, to FOMO, the fear of messing up, where suddenly they start saying, oh man, if I do this and it doesn't work out, everyone's going to think that I'm an idiot and it's going to reflect poorly on my reputation and my team's going to give me a hard time. So it's really important at each phase in that process to follow the steps, to observe the milestones, to follow the methodology, to ask the questions correct, for sales managers to make sure, yeah, my team, my sales rep has this, they can answer it cogently, they understand what's going on. If I push them or kind of back test the scenario, they can explain to me why they're confident it's qualified. So it has to happen together as a team, but you have to follow those steps all the way around.
So it seems to me, Ed, that you could use the fear of messing up as to your advantage, in that if you are really digging into what the problem is, you may identify a lot of things that your competitors aren't. If your competitors have this sort of that first to third approach, hey, let me be the quickest to get this in and all that kind of stuff, they can miss key aspects of, during that process. And then as you approach it, you can be very clear that, hey, we also think there's an issue here and we can help you with it. And so they start seeing that and saying, well, wait a second, I know this is going to cost a little bit more, but they might be right. We got to solve for this issue. And so we don't want to mess that up either. And, part of what when I'm working with manufacturers, one of the things we're always looking at are things like margins. And so we want top margins that we can get, so we can produce more EBITDA, so we can produce more value in this business. And I think trying to, rush it through to the end and just try to get that quote done, you're going to leave money on it, potentially leave money or opportunity, or, the other thing is diversification. So we want as many different customers as we can get, but within a customer, we want as much of that share of their wallet as we can possibly get. And we can do that by digging in and helping other areas, at least the way I kind of look at it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I love the margin example, because if we ask most people why their margin is shrinking, they're going to tell us we just got this price pressure. We end up discounting in order to get deals. Well, the discounting, and so often the answer is, well, let's send our sales team to get some negotiation training, because if they negotiated better, they wouldn't have to discount, except wind it back. And the reason they're discounting is because they cut from first to third, just like you said. If they had gone around second, if they understood the compelling reason to buy, if they had the confirmation the person was willing to do business with them and pay them more, all that kind of stuff happens along the way and establish credibility, then you're not going to have that conversation about discounting. It's going to be a very different kind of a conversation. So it's really, just like in manufacturing, going back to determine the root cause. It's not lack of negotiation skill. It's lack of a proper sales process, and maybe lack of proper sales management and methodology and other stuff that goes along with it. But I think you're absolutely right. And the ability to uncover other potential projects, because they realize your expertise. Conversation raises other points, and they say, well, geez, I hadn't thought about it that way. Let's actually take a walk over here and look at this too, because this is something we've been wrestling with, and maybe you can help us with that. And suddenly you're uncovering other projects.
Well, think about how much easier it is to pick up new business with an existing customer. and expanding throughout versus, yes, again, I like diverse customer base, but at the same time, if you can continue to grow that within the customer, they become more stuck to you because all the things that you can do, and that just makes it easier. Now this process is easier. And I think you mentioned forecasting accuracy for leads and pipe. All of a sudden this becomes a different game.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's got to be nothing more embarrassing for an executive to sit down with the bank and say, "Here's our forecast, and it's completely different than it was last time." And the bank, I mean, you just lose credibility with that commercial lending relationship
Mm-hmm.
when your forecast is so consistently inaccurate. And so, what people mostly end up doing is taking their forecast out of Salesforce or wherever they
Mm-hmm.
putatively have it, and then they spend a Saturday afternoon with a spreadsheet and a Word document trying to anecdotally rationalize what's going on, and then they present a story as opposed to data. And if you just
Mm-hmm.
go back and do it right from the beginning, then you end up with a predictable process, and along the way. I mean, is there unpredictability? Yeah, absolutely. Can a company
Mm-hmm.
where you're about to sell a deal get acquired and put all transactions on hold? Of course, things happen, but you're going to have a much better insight into what's going on. The associated aspect of that is that you also then have some accurate data. So you
Mm-hmm.
accurately know what your kind of quote to close rate is. You know how long your sales process is. You know where in the journey deals are falling off, you're discovering they weren't properly qualified. Then you can use that for coaching and improvement. So having the right metrics, let me say it differently. Having the right process makes it consistent and predictable, and then that means you can actually get meaningful metrics from it that allow you to further improve as you go.
Well, think about, what that means. I get better at my forecasting and my future revenue. Then I get my production environment geared up to that. Then I get my hiring. I get everything else in the organization starts flowing because I mean, realistically, the start of the revenue cycle begins with that sales process and what I'm bringing in, what can I bring in, and then you can map your operations around it, and then so on and so on, all the way down the line. And now you've got more predictability and data to be able to better manage your business.
And I'll say just kind of preemptively, because I know a lot of people listening to this may say, yeah, that all sounds good, but not in my industry, or our industry is different, or our buyers
Yeah.
aren't predictable, or capital equipment is different, or whatever the case may be. Yes, of course, there are idiosyncrasies and there are wrinkles, but the reality is that having a proper sales process will absolutely increase the predictability. It's going to take
Mhm.
training. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to have good sales managers and good salespeople. It's going to be a mindset shift. You're not going to want to pass a sales rep in the hallway and say, "Oh, by the way, what quotes have you done recently?" Because you'll kind of blow some of the work. But for every industry, I can assure you that a good sales process will pay enormous dividends.
Well, and two, Ed, you say predictability. I keep hearing that word. When we have predictability, I think of comfort. When I think of comfort, I think of value, right? Why? Because whether it's a bank lending or whether it's someone buying, you buy what you're comfortable, what you're knowledgeable of. And if you can explain that rather than just trying to spin a story, then now someone can get very comfortable around that. And that creates value because, again, you buy what you're comfortable with, you lend to what you're comfortable and you're knowledgeable of. So the more process procedure around that rather than just the old throwing spaghetti on a wall and seeing what sticks kind of methodology, really, I would imagine would pay off, and value is what we're all about, right? Building value in our business, no matter what that may look like for you in the future. So,
Yeah, and I think speaking of the future, you can take it a step further. If the owner of a company goes through this process and is personally comfortable with the predictability of revenue, then they might be willing to accept a higher earnout, which might boost their valuation as opposed to expecting more cash up front. So
yeah.
I think you're right. It permeates all kinds of aspects of value and business.
Well, when you're dealing with, and that's a great point. When you're dealing with a buyer, so if we're thinking whether you're selling 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 15 years from now, when you're dealing with a buyer, customer predictability, customer stickiness and the margin, all those things. We were talking about the value driver of customer capital, but there's also the other value driver of systems and processes.
Yep.
And so this is an intersection of those two concepts to build more value in a business. And one of the things that a buyer will look for is scalability and repeatability, training, the ability to, so if you're reliant on one person to do something, then you could be in trouble. If something happens to that person, they retire, gets hit by this proverbial bus, all of those different things. Now, all of a sudden, as a buyer, you're not very comfortable. You may be in trouble.
Right.
So you buy this company, and all of a sudden that person goes, something happens, and you're losing value. So that's why I think this is such an important topic to hit on, is because it does intersect 2 points that come together to create more value.
What if? I mean, here's kind of an aspirational scenario. But what if a company could go to market, go to the transaction market, some sort of anticipating a liquidity event, and say, look, we got 2 sets of IP. We've got our business IP, our products, our knowledge, our inventions, all that kind of stuff. But we also have revenue growth IP. We have such a refined process to give us predictability in our revenue growth that we believe this represents strategic IP as well, and should be part of how we're valued.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think that's a great point. I think that's something that everybody should consider. So, Ed, thanks for being on today. I think we could probably go all day going back and forth about all these different things, if we had the time and could keep recording all that kind of stuff. But Ed, thanks for being on and sharing some more insights. Looking forward to having you on throughout the year and covering different topics as we evolve this thought process.
Yeah, my pleasure. Like I said at the beginning, it's always a great opportunity to chat with both of you gentlemen. I really appreciate the perspective you bring to it, and we always have good conversations.
Absolutely. All right. Well, for everyone listening, thank you very much. I hope you had some good takeaways. And as always, if there's questions or anything we can help you out with, please give us a call.
To learn more about James Moore & Company's manufacturing services, go to jmco.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our More on Manufacturing series to receive updates when new videos and podcasts are released. If you'd like to be a guest, or if there's a topic you'd like to see covered on a future episode, contact us on our website. You can also follow us on social media for more news as the landscape on manufacturing continues to rapidly evolve.